you, Kelly, so much. And thank you to CASA in Wisconsin for offering this Black History Month program. And thank you all for unmuting your videos. I have to tell you, when you have the opportunity to engage with others and you're on Zoom, that adds a layer of complexity. It becomes further complex when everybody's video is muted because I can't see your faces, as Kelly said. So welcome to this hour in discussing Black history. And so while you have unmuted your video, and I really do appreciate that, I'm going to ask you if you would be sure that your mics are muted. And absolutely unmute your mic if you have a comment. But for the most part, if you would be willing to mute your mic, that would be great. I am going to go ahead and share my screen with you all so we can get some introductions going and get our conversation going. All righty. All right, so I should also mute my phone because something's going on here. All righty. All right, very good. Can everyone see my screen? Let's see. Marla, I see your face. Can you see my screen? Perfect, perfect. Okay, very good. So you all, this is going to be a conversation about social services and our history, our current stance, if you would say, and our future. So children of the storm, past, present, and future. I would like to welcome everyone to this talk, and I know that there are several people on this call, but I am wondering if just perhaps one or two people would be willing to share why this particular webinar or why this particular call is important to them today. So I'm wondering if just one or two people might be able to share. I can see.
Adrienne, can you hear me?
Yes.
I like what's going on your head there, sweetheart.
Do you like that? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, I do. Well, certainly, first and foremost, I'm one of your biggest fans. It's because the presentation comes from you. But when you get Adrienne, you get her heart, and you get her experience, and you get all of it. And you help us to understand as a white woman weaving her way through a world that confuses her sometimes and celebrates a lot of it. So information you can share with us makes our role easier, and the children are the huge recipients of that. Hello, Deborah.
Thank you, Mary, for bringing that, and I'm glad you said that. So this is about us gaining knowledge, but what we recognize is that, as you just said, Mary, and I can't say it any other way, the children are the biggest recipients, and so that is why it's important to have this conversation, to begin to think about children of color, particularly their past experiences with social services and child welfare, their current experience, and their future. So thank you, Mary Casa, for your encouragement and for bringing this to the fore. Anybody else like to share why you are here today? What compelled you to come? Anybody? Well, you know what? I'm going to pick on someone because I see a familiar face. They probably know it's coming because now they're smiling, so they're prepared. Maria, it's so good to see you. It is so good to see you. Sorry, I caught you right in the middle of that lunch piece, right?
No, that's okay. I know it, you guys. My name is Maria Buntis. I'm a school social worker in the Green Bay District. Miss Fletcher, she was one of my teachers in the graduate program. I love her classes. And for me, it was, like another way to see the things, but also like having somebody, as a, a member of, minority, I feel like having somebody also in that role, coming from teaching and teaching us about like race and about why this is important for anyone. So when I found out this webinar was going to be Miss Fletcher, and I was like, yep, I'm going. It's my lunchtime, but she has a lot of knowledge to share. And we know like a lot, that, population is changing, and we need to, be educated to provide, to work with people from different backgrounds, and she has a lot to share, and it's going to help everyone who is going to be in this training or any other trainings she is presenting.
Thank you, Maria, for just giving us that bit of information, and it is really good to see you. One more person. Anybody? Why'd you come?
I can share.
Yes.
Very similar to Maria, I think, well, I know that a lot of the children we serve are Black, and, they're going through stuff that a lot of us can't really understand. So I think it's an opportunity for us to be able to open our minds and just learn more about what they're going through so that we can better serve them. Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and push through. This is just a little bit about me, and just a little bit of information about me. I'm going to start at the bottom with my research focus, which is really on implicit bias as a driver, honestly, as a hidden driver. So I really do help organizations, individuals, including myself, to be aware of how my biases often drive my behavior without outside of my awareness. So that's really an important piece. Currently, I am the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, which is at Case Western Reserve University, and it is a school of social work. Our family spent from 2007 until 2017 in Northeastern Wisconsin, where I had the opportunity to teach at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay with students like Maria. And also I had the amazing opportunity of working with court-appointed special advocates in Brown County, where many of you are. I also worked with Stockbridge Munsee, which is a Native American tribe, which was moved from the east to the west to Wisconsin. And I received my PhD from Loyola University, my master's degree from Case Western Reserve at the Mandel School, and my undergraduate degree from Cleveland State University. And I'm also the married mother of 4. So that's just a little bit about me. So I just want to go ahead and dig into our objectives for this afternoon while you all are eating your lunch. Like, I can see Daryl on my screen, and Daryl looked like he was eating something really good. Like, I haven't had lunch, Daryl. You might have to share. So here are our objectives for today. We would like to work toward increasing our understanding of the historical underpinnings of the child welfare system as it has associated itself with the African American child. We'd also like to move toward increasing our understanding of the current trends in child welfare in regard to the Black or African American child. And lastly, we want to consider how we can create partnerships with organizations that typically serve Black children, and how that might enhance our work as court-appointed special advocates. So these are our objectives today, and I've really simply broken down our agenda in those 3 parts. So we're going to look at the historical experience of Black children, their current experience, and the notion of co-creating a new reality, or partnerships with organizations that we don't typically engage with in order to enhance the experience of the Black child, of the African American child. All right, are there any questions so far? Okay, all right. Then we're going to keep moving forward. So let's look and think about this historical experience. The book that really spurred my thinking on about this opportunity to talk about Black history and the African American child, or the Black child, either term is acceptable. It's always wise to ask a person how they prefer to be referred to, right? So this book, Children of the Storm, was written in 1972 by Andrew Billingsley and Jeannie Giovannoni. And they really did take a historical look at the child welfare system in relationship to the Black child, or the African American child. They also thought about the overall experience of the child outside of the child welfare system and within the family system. They lean into the resiliency of Black and African American communities. Very often there is this notion that Black communities are utterly dependent upon the outside for services in order to move their lives forward. Whereas to some extent there is a level of dependency, the Black or African American community is terribly resilient. and they have been resilient since and I will use this word carefully, but honestly, since their kidnapping from the continent of Africa, primarily those countries that sit in West Africa. This book also leans into social policy regarding Black and African American families. So the first thing that I would like to do as we sit on this call together is to really think about the context in which not only the Black family, but all of our families engage with the foundational underpinnings of this country. So I would like to bring to the fore the center diamond, which notes the Elizabethan Poor Laws and the institution of slavery. For those of you who are on this call who are historians, those of you who are teachers who spend a lot of time thinking about the past and vestiges of the past, what we know is that when this country was founded, it was founded on the Elizabethan Poor Laws, and the Elizabethan Poor Laws really formulated ways of helping based on the worthy poor and the unworthy poor, right? So individuals who were considered unworthy poor were typically able-bodied men and women. If you were able-bodied, if you didn't have any physical challenges, if you didn't have any emotional or mental challenges, you were considered the unworthy poor. So for whatever reason, you found yourself unable to work or not work, and you found yourself in a destitute situation, right? You were considered the unworthy poor. And if you received any help, it should first and foremost come from your family and then perhaps from the church, but not necessarily from the government. And then on the other hand, we have individuals who we consider the worthy poor. To some extent, they were considered children and women to some extent, but they were typically individuals who had physical challenges or emotional challenges, and they were unable to find themselves gainfully employed. But still, services or help should first come from the family. First, help should then secondly come from the church. And lastly, the government should step in and help. So the Elizabethan Poor Laws really help us to think about the constitution that those who discovered, and I put that in quotes, and founded this country brought with them. That this is the way we help individuals. So at the same time, Elizabethan Poor Laws were being baked into the Constitution, as it were, of our country. The institution of slavery was also conceived, and it was wielding its power. So what we understand is that African individuals who were brought to this country for the sole purpose of working were in a completely functioning in a completely different system, and that was the institution of slavery. Right? So what we know is that all other individuals, initially, let me go back a little bit, Native American folks were initially a part of the institution of slavery, as were some white individuals who had immigrated to this country. But what occurred over time was that those individuals who were wielding this institution discovered that some Native Americans did not have an immunity to some of the diseases that the founders of this country brought with them. And so they typically suffered physically, and they were unable to stay with the work that was necessary during slavery. White folks, typically Irish and other folks who came over who were indentured servants, could easily escape the system of either indentured servitude or other slave-like institutions. But what they found with the Black body, with the African, was that the skin was marked, not literally marked, but it was difficult to escape because of the color of the skin. So the institution of slavery became formed or was formulated around this particular people group. Now, I lean into this because these are the underpinnings of not only our country, but also of social services and the child welfare system. So the Black or African American family or child had their existence outside of these institutions, as it were, when we think of the Elizabethan Poor Laws. So here on this slide, what we see is that over time, these systems, our health system, the political system, religious systems, our law enforcement system, and I want to stop right there for just a second. For those of you, again, who are steeped in history and historians, you all will be fully aware that our law enforcement system is has a direct connection to slave catching systems, right? So those individuals who were sent out in order to retrieve runaway slaves, there's a direct relationship, or we can draw a direct line from that initial institution to our current law enforcement system, which is pretty unique. And it's also very informative because it helps us to see this vestige of the past and how it continues to wield its power, as it were. So kind of keep that notion in the back of your head that our law enforcement system was directly birthed out of the institution that sought to capture runaway slaves. The educational institution was also formed around the family, and also our economic institution. And I want to assert to you this afternoon that these institutions really had the family on the screen in mind. They were created to support this particular family on the screen. They were created to support, in essence, the white family. They were created to support the health of primarily white families. They were created to support any political needs of the white family. The religious system is very similar. The educational system is also connected with meeting the needs of primarily white families, as well as our economic system. So what we know historically, again, and I'm going to really reinforce this piece, is that all of these systems were created with this family not in mind, because it was in fact the institution of slavery that provided health and wellness to the slave. It was the institution of slavery that kind of cemented the way we think about policy when it came to the eventual African-American, right? Again, the law enforcement system, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, is an outgrowth of the system that caught and retrieved runaway slaves. You all are fully aware that Africans were not allowed to read, not allowed to learn to read, or many of them were not allowed to learn to write. So the educational system really had to do with reinforcing agriculture, but in a way that was in a form of servitude, which we see eventually as sharecropping. The economic system, our economic system, is actually built on the shoulders of the African slave, right? So what we know is that these systems were built outside of the notion of caring for this particular group of people. That is why it is important for us to come to terms with some of the nuanced behaviors that we are currently seeing within our social services system, because our social services system or child welfare was never really intended to meet the needs of the Black family. And what happens over time, or what happened over time, is that white folks, Black folks, other folks who lived in this country really came to understand this notion that this particular group of people has to function outside, must function outside of our current systems. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment, because I would really like to take a few minutes to get your response. And also, I'm going to take a few moments to show you a video. I'm going to pull it up right now because I didn't pull it up before I came into the session.
Which doll is the Black?
All right, perfect. So I am wondering if there are any thoughts thus far about these underpinnings, historical underpinnings regarding the Black family or the African-American family in our country. Any thoughts?
I'm MJ Price. I'm with CASA, Patrick County, Maryland. Never even occurred to me the the link, if you will, regarding law enforcement.
Yes.
And it's so, once you say like, it would never have even occurred to me.
Correct. Thank you. Thank you. It's MJ. Thank you, MJ, for bringing that piece. Yes. And you all can look up that history. That history is out there to be known, but it is a little known history, right? So there is a direct correlation between retrieving slaves and law enforcement. Yeah, it's a very interesting notion. And so the piece that I would like to drive home right now, as we go to this video, is the fact that folks of color, people of color, folks of African descent, recognize somehow very quickly their place in society, that all of these social institutions were formed not with them in mind. So they recognize that, as well as white folks recognize that, and folks of other race ethnicities. So very important to realize and to recognize. I'm going to go back and share my screen, and we're going to watch what have been called the Kenneth and Mamie Clark doll studies. Many of you may be familiar with them, but we're going to take a few minutes to look at this and perhaps think out loud a little bit. All right, can everybody see this screen? I will turn, yes. Marla, can you shake your head for me? All right, perfect. I'm going to go back just a little bit. And we'll start this.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me?
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one. Show me the doll that you like best or that you like to play with. This one. I like that one. Okay. This one. That one? I like to play with this. And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll? He's white. And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And can you and why does that look bad? Because it's black. And why do you think that's a nice doll? Because she's white. And can you give me the doll that looks like you? 15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll.
All right, I'm going to stop share so that we can think about this. So I want to tell you that the Kenneth and Mamie Clark doll studies were first put forth in the late 1960s. The last clip that we saw was done in the, I think they were done in about 2010, maybe. So it's been reworked and reworked for validity, and what we tend to see are the same exact responses. So what does this mean? So this means that this notion of difference, this notion of being excluded from a civil society, it happens really early, everybody. It happens really early, and it does not only happen to children of color, it happens to white children too. What are your thoughts?
Before or after my eyes started tearing up.
Right, right. So I bring this to the fore to help to create a sense of our history and a sense of how quickly these notions about who we are and who the other is make their way to the fore. It happens very quickly. All right. If there are other comments, please feel free to make them. I am going to go back to my screen. So the Kenneth and Mamie Clark doll studies help us to really grapple with the experience of our children, even in 2021, the experience of children of color, Black or African-American children.
Dr. Fletcher,
Yes.
there's two chats in the chat box. The first one, Bryce said that it's heartbreaking. And then the second one, Missy kind of asked a question in that racism is a learned behavior.
Mhm. So yeah, Missy, that's good. So yes. Ta-Nehisi Coates said that racism is the father and race is the child. So racism was conceived at the very beginnings of our country, of the founding of this country. And racism set out to put certain people in power and keep other people in a particular place of servitude. And then race, as I mentioned, or I tried to allude to earlier, was really created to more or less mark the body, to create or to keep certain individuals in a place of servitude. So yes, we do learn racism. And at this point in our country, racism is also baked into our policies and our procedures. In the family unit, racism is passed on to children through what we call folk theory. And so many have heard me talk about this before. Folk theory is really the exchange of information between a caregiver and his child about who they are. You will go to school, you will succeed, and you will become a prominent person. And it is also the sharing of information about who others are. You see that little boy over there? He's not going to be successful. He'll probably be someone who either is a janitor or works in this field or that field, but this person is very different from you. So what I say about folk theory is what we butter our children's toast with in the morning as we tell them who they are. Folk theory is the sugar that we sprinkle onto their cereal every morning. Right. So it is unwittingly passed on to our children, and that allows racism oftentimes unwittingly to be passed on to our children. But as I mentioned, it is well baked into policy by this time. We are aware that federal housing policy, which I'm not sure if we're going to get to in this talk, but federal housing policy during the New Deal and after the Second World War strictly prohibited Black individuals, Latino individuals, Native American individuals from moving into certain areas, right? Strictly prohibited in black and white, we could see it. So racism is alive and real, real and well, because it is baked into policy. So I hope that helps to answer that question.
And we had one more chat come in asking, is it possible the children are most used to a white doll since they're more widely distributed?
Yeah, so that might be a slice of the pie. That might be a slice of the pie. We certainly can't say that is not a part of it, right? So that will be a slice of the pie. But what we also know is that our children of color, typically have experiences with white individuals as teachers, as librarians, as doctors, as individuals who are seen on television as helping in soup lines. So what we typically see, or what children of color, Black children, Latino children, Native American children typically see, is that white individuals find themselves in a prominent place, right? And so this notion of goodness and badness is easily equated with behaviors. So that is definitely a part of it. And I can just share a really quick story. When I was a little girl, I can remember my mother searching high and low for a Black doll. She found the Black doll, and she was so happy to bring that doll home. I remember her name was Buttercup. Right?
Mhm.
So you are right. We need to make more Black babies, right? More Black baby dolls. And that kind of change is really taking place right now in our country. Any other thoughts before I go back to my screen?
There's one more comment from Missy mentioning redlining neighborhoods.
Yes. So again, we go back to federal policy. Redlining was written into federal policy, and redlining meant that individuals who live in this area will not receive certain services. Individuals who live in this area, their housing, their property was cost a certain amount, and the amounts of the cost of those houses did not increase over time, as areas that were not redlined had a very different experience. They also had access to better schooling, because schools are based, school funding is based on the tax base of homes. They had access to healthcare. They had access to grocery stores versus an area that we now call a food desert. So redlining played a tremendous part, a tremendous role in how some of our educational systems look now, and the experiences of children of color. All right, I'm going to go back to my screen, and we're just going to talk for a little while about this notion of, not a notion, but the experience of settlement houses. And settlement houses were, settlement houses and charity organization societies were these two big social services milieus that really stepped in to help individuals who had immigrated to our country, and to give them educational help as far as job searches were concerned. They worked to give individuals certain skills like parenting skills, like becoming a seamstress, and other things that could provide some type of social uplift. But what we know is that many of the settlement houses did in fact remain segregated until the 1930s. So if we move out from slavery, what we recognize is that there was a long period of time where children of color, African-American families, did not receive services from any formalized organization or agency. I bring Phyllis Wheatley to the fore because Phyllis Wheatley was a slave who eventually became highly educated within her family and was published as a poet, but first in Europe and not in the US. Elizabeth Lindsay Davis was the one who started many of the charity organization societies, or I should say settlement houses in Black communities. This picture on the screen is a picture of the Phyllis Wheatley Settlement House, which is right in Cleveland, Ohio. And as a child, I had the opportunity to actually visit that place and participate in a camp program. The University of Wisconsin also has a settlement house. It is the old Coleman House, and it is right near the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. So settlement houses really did serve a purpose. So folks who worked in settlement houses actually settled in the community and reached out to the folks in the community to help with social uplift. Charity organization societies or charity house organizations really they did philanthropic work, and they had this moral notion that they needed to go into the community, not to live there, but they would go and do what they call friendly visiting and really point out the error of a family's ways or an individual's ways in order to help them not to pass on those negative behaviors to their children. So charity house organizations and settlement houses took two different approaches to helping. W.E.B. Du Bois said that there were some settlement houses that were exclusively for Black or African-American families. The Phyllis Wheatley Association was one of those. There were settlement houses that were exclusively for white families. There were settlement houses that professed not to discriminate, but typically did. And there were also settlement houses that didn't make a statement either way, but were typically discriminating. So again, this has to do with social uplift. We also want to move through time and recognize that the Social Security Act came to be in 1935, and with it, aid to families with dependent children came to the fore. This act really helped families where the father was deceased, disabled, or had deserted the family. It did not think about families where there was underemployment or lack of employment. And really prior to 1971, there was no programming to simply care for children who were in need. So the thing that we need to remember is that Slavery was the institution that cared for African American / Black families. And with the inception of AFDC, Black families were not able to receive services. They were actually denied services from this portion of the Social Security Act. So it became necessary for folks in the Black community to reach back to their past and lean into something called tribal socialism. And the notion of tribal socialism is simply, if I have rice, you have rice. It did not matter how oppressed a Black family was or how few resources they had. There was always this spirit of benevolence. There was always this kind of surveillance of the landscape to help folks recognize who had resources and who didn't. And if a family needed something, even if the resources of one family were limited, they would still provide. So this notion of, if I have rice, you have rice, is a very real part of many Black families and the Black community. During this time, from slavery to 1935, probably up to 1950, there were 5 major sources of aid for the Black family. Churches were a tremendous source of aid. So were some of the schools, right? There were secret organizations like the Eastern Star and the Masons. And there were actually folks who, after Reconstruction, which was really a heyday for the escaped slave, because that is when many folks actually rose to prominence in the political arena, and they were able to attend some schools. So there were individuals who had acquired a substantial amount of money, and then they were able to pour money into schools. Primarily historically Black colleges and universities, they were able to pour money into communities and to churches. Women's clubs were also on the forefront of tribal socialism, helping individuals within the Black community. Other sources of aid were orphanages that were established just for Black children, day nurseries, and also kindergartens. So I want to bring to the fore, and I put it in this format so that we could see the timetable, how the balance of the Black family was upset as a result of so many of our policies that we can still see being actively reinforced right now in 2021. So in the 19th century, of course, we had the institution of slavery. And we had also the Elizabethan poor laws that manifest themselves in many different ways. But at that time, children should be taken from their poor families. So if a family was poor, underemployed, many thought that it was a worthy endeavor to remove these children from their home in order that these children wouldn't be infected by the instability or lack of work ethic found in some of these families. So that was the notion in the 19th century. Remove children from poor families so that they can acquire different skills. In the 19th century, the notion was that children should not be removed from their homes for poverty alone. So for the Black family, they were initially totally ignored in the 20th century, right? But then social services began to gradually extend services to the Black family. What we recognize is that those services were limited and that those services increasingly included removing children from their homes, right? So it goes back to the notion of the 19th century that somehow these families are passing on this negative and this lack of work ethic to their children. So it was necessary to remove them, to free them from these vestiges. So Billingsley and Giovannoni really predicted very early on that we would find this disproportionality in our child welfare system, simply because of the beliefs about how poor families should be treated. And this information was basically, or template was basically laid over the African American family and has had and continues to have a tremendous effect on where Black children are right now. From 1920 to 1940, African African American or Black child caring institutions grew in the 20th century, but then their numbers started to decrease, meaning the institutions that really cared for Black children. Between the 1950s and the 1960s, Black or African American children remained institutionalized. During this time period, the National Urban League and the National Association for Black Social Workers were birthed, and they really started to think about ways to care for Black children. And again, I want to usher in this notion of tribal socialism. So individuals who had risen to prominence or some educational attainment really recognized that they needed to be doing more work in order to care for the children who looked like them. I'm going to go past that slide, and I really want to talk about very briefly how the National Association of Black Social Workers birthed kinship care. Kinship care is a well-known concept in most of our child welfare and social services institutions. But I want to tell you that kinship care existed prior to social services picking it up and using it. It existed outside of the child welfare system. And kinship care is simply a grandmother taking care of her grandchildren when her daughter or her son were unable to fulfill their roles as parents. So kinship care has really become baked into our social services institution, which is a very, very good thing. Again, it is an indication of tribal socialism. So I want to talk really quickly about the current experience of Black or African American children and how disproportionality continues to upset the balance of the family. Earlier, I did not state this, but I want to say it now. When I showed you the picture of the white family, and then I showed you a picture of a Black family very early on with all of the systems floating around that family, I want to specifically note that the family is the most intimate and intricate relationship that the child will experience. It is the most intimate and intricate experience that you had during your formative years. And I think it's important for us to recognize that and realize that in order to help us to walk very carefully when we think about removing a child from that milieu. The family is the most intimate experience that a child will have. Here is a slide indicating the current state of disproportionality. So these numbers are from 2018. So we can make the assumption that they are still very relevant right now. And here we see that Black children make up Black children make up 13.71% of the child population within the US. When we go to this icon, we see that the percentage of Black children in foster care is 22.75, which is twice their rate in the current population, in our population. So disproportionality is alive and well right now in the United States. And this gives us a picture of where we are and the work that still needs to be done, and how you, as a court-appointed special advocate, having this knowledge, can begin to think differently about the history of this child who I am now appointed to and their current experience, and what needs to be done in order to begin to lean into some of our systemic troubles. So let's think briefly about partnerships and other strategies that will help us with this, as I just mentioned. So it is important for us to address the impact of individual biases in reporting and in intervention. Many of you are mandated reporters, and it is necessary for us to report when we suspect that child maltreatment is occurring, right? I am not by any way suggesting that we would not do that, because we will absolutely do that. The piece that we need to be mindful of is how often our individual biases frame what we see. You know, we talked a little earlier about this notion of folk theory, this good and bad notion. We saw that borne out in the Kenneth and Mamie Clark-Ball studies. So that notion should give us pause. And when we suspect that we are seeing maltreatment, we want to wonder about how we are filtering what we see? Do our individual biases have anything to do with how we are interpreting what we see? We also want to develop culturally responsive practices. So we want to ask ourselves, how best, as a court-appointed advocate who is going into a home where there is a Black child, how best do we culturally engage with this particular family, right? We also want to begin to think about how we can recruit and retain advocates who are people of color, who are also Latino, who are also Native American. What do we do in order to expand our resources, right? Do we reach out to churches? Do we engage with beauty shops? Do we reach out to individuals who are Black, who are part of sororities or fraternities? How do we expand the playing field so that we are recruiting more folks of color? Because that is terribly important. And I want to end with this slide, and then I'm going to unshare my screen and wonder with you what your comments or concerns are. In 1970, the White House Conference of the Children came away with this statement: to rid this nation of racism, we must bring to the attention of our people the gravity and the scope of this disease. Racism is, in fact, a disease that we pass on from one person to another, explaining how it is transmitted and how it is dangerously destroying the strength of our nation and dividing itself against itself. So racism is in fact a disease, and we see it wielding its power, especially as we look at the historical foundations of our social services institution, how it was created and how it continues to engage with Black African children of color. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Any questions, concerns?
I have, oh,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Cindy.
no, go ahead, Deb.
Okay, thanks. Good to see Adrienne. And I think what you've done is just awaken a part of me that didn't realize all of this. And I've been an advocate for 7 years, and I had a disproportionate number of children that were Black, African American. And I was in neighborhoods and homes just in Green Bay that I would never have been in. And I remember just realizing where I was and who I was. So thanks for reigniting that. And I also like your suggestions for recruiting, to reach out to those kinds of groups, because there are people that would love to be advocates. Thank you. Good to see you.
And you know, those folks also have a strong sense of how to engage culturally, so they can be of such help to us, right? Right, good. Cindy.
Well, I have a question and a comment. Can you, AFDC, did you say that Black people were not allowed to receive AFDC monies?
Very early on, Cindy, they were absolutely denied services.
Wow, I just want to say that this has been a fantastic presentation, Adrienne. I love the historical perspective of it. I think, you know, it's not that long ago.
It's not.
It's not that long ago. And if we don't teach everybody the historical perspective, we're not going to have an understanding of this. So I just really want to thank you. It really has inspired me to get more of that historical perspective. And the whole idea of worthy or not, that is so alive today yet, and something we need to work on so desperately.
I agree, Cindy. And you know, looking at our history really helps to pull the curtain back, and it really helps us to understand why certain people groups may behave a certain way. Right? What we think is that you're behaving this way because you are bad, or because you don't understand this piece. But there are historical underpinnings that drive behaviors. Right?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Kiana. I'm a advocate for CASA Brock County.
Hi.
Just kind of stemming off of Sydney's comment. when being, more mindful of that historical aspect, I think it's also kind of important to realize how generational that can be as well. Since it wasn't that long ago, it's really easy. I can think of, right, even if you were to just look up white families versus Black families, I know plenty of people who today live in a house that their grandparents bought, that they don't have to pay rent for, or they stayed there for a while when they first moved out. You hear so many stories like that where it's very generational. That generational success kind of helps give you a leg up. Whereas if you're coming from a Black family who, somebody's grandmother may have never even had the opportunity to buy a house because they weren't, legally allowed to, or what have you, that generational impact is huge.
It is tremendous. And you're talking about the accumulation of generational wealth. When you all get an opportunity, when we're off of our call, go to YouTube and Google Adam Ruins Everything, the Suburbs. And he just kind of frames it for us. And it's so quick and it's so easy. And you go, oh, I get it, right? So lots of families of color were not allowed to accrue generational wealth because we know that that comes from home ownership. And home ownership was placed out of reach because of federal policies, because of predatory lending and redlining. Other questions or comments? Okay. Well, Kelly. Yep, Deb.
I do have a question, Adrienne. As you work with college students today, what are you seeing with the younger kids coming up? You're talking to some of us whose memory, we know some of the history that you were telling about, but what are you finding with some of your students?
Yeah. So Deb, to be quite honest, what we are finding, and I'll move it away from the students for just a moment, what we are finding is that our curriculum, our social work curriculum and other curriculums have not caught up yet.
Mm-hmm.
We are working to catch up, and we are working to create more anti-racist curriculum, because what we have found in a review of our curriculum is that we are repeating the same folk theory, as it were, throughout our curriculum.
Okay.
We tend to highlight certain authors versus other authors, right? I'll just give an example. Tim Wise, y'all can Google him too. He really is an individual. He is a white male who his work has been in anti-racism. And one of the things that Tim Wise says is that these words that I am sharing with you all as a white man are words and understanding and content that I have learned from people of color. So this is nothing new, but it tends to be more acceptable when it comes from a white male. But what I really like you to do is listen to where the content first came from. So Deb, that's something that we're working on, right? We're working on infiltrating our curriculum in such a way that there are many authors of different race ethnicities, not just Black folks, but different race ethnicities, right? So that we are creating, hopefully, a more just society as these social workers go out into the field. They are very much open to it, but it can still be, because of our history, the history of some white folks, there is a little bit of pushback. So we get both. We get both. That's a good question. Any other thoughts or questions? Any lasting comments?
Dr. Fletcher. Oh, go ahead.
Well, Adrienne, can you hear me?
Yes.
I remember vividly going to Milwaukee with you and Marilyn to see a family, and specifically you joined us because you were a Black woman, and this was a Black family, and Marilyn sat out in the car and you and I went inside. And the reason I'm bringing it up, it's the way you modeled how best to walk into this family. We've never met this person. They were burning things in their fireplace, books, because it was so cold. And you engaged with the father. You talked with him. You didn't bring up anything about why we were there until he was settled and he was ready. and then you moved to the adolescent boy, if I'm remembering correctly. But it was such an opportunity to watch you engage in this home visiting, your style, your presence, and what needed to happen in order to move forward and still walk out of there within an hour or at the best 2. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I do, Mary. And thank you for bringing that to the fore. I think what you bring to the forefront is the importance of the fact that everything takes place in the context of relationship. Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so if we don't work to create an organic relationship with the families that we're serving, chances are we're not going to have the positive outcomes that we so desire for the children. Everything takes place in the context of relationship. Make relationship first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, for that reminder.
Mm-hmm.
Just a couple more minutes. Any other thoughts?
Carrie Ann mentioned in the chat box that there's a pretty great limited series on Netflix called Amend that delves into the history behind the 13th and 14th Amendments.
Good. Yes. Perfect.
What is, I'm sorry, what is that called again? Can you put that in the chat box?
It's called Amend.
Oh, Amend. Oh.
And I'm not sure if Ava DuVernay's 13th is still available on Netflix, but if it is, watch it there or find it somewhere else. It's well worth the watch. 13th, which solely focuses on the 13th Amendment. So I want to leave you with one book title. And this book title will be helpful to you, and it's been helpful to me. I used it to teach a class in January. It is called The Everyday Language of White Racism, and it's written by a woman who is a linguist. Her name is Jane Hill, and she really helps us to understand folk theory and helps us to understand how insidious racism is in our country and how it is just perpetuated by well-intended folks, even people who look like me. Right? So I'm not letting myself off the hook in any way, shape, or form. We are all somehow complicit. Right? And so this book is a dense read, but it's well worth it. Well worth it.
Who is the author again?
Jane Hill.
Oh,
yep.
Thank you.
Yep. And for anybody who's interested, read Children of the Storm, Billingsley and Giovannoni. It really gives a comprehensive history of social services in our country as they relate to Black African-American children.
I think we are now at 1 o'clock. So I just want to thank everybody for attending. You have my contact information if you have any further questions. This is recorded, so we will post the recording on our website and you'll get that link. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Adrienne.
Thank you.